After the release of Yakuza 0, the reception to the game was overwhelmingly positive. Seeing such high praise for the prequel from fans, and feeling like the original was pretty outdated by this point, the team at RGG decided that they wanted to remake Yakuza 1 so fans could enjoy it just as much as the more recent entries in the series. This remake would go on to be titled Yakuza Kiwami, literally translating to Yakuza Extreme, and fans would not be left waiting for it for very long. Despite the fact that work on this game would only begin after the release of 0, the team managed to complete the project incredibly quickly, with Yakuza 0 having released in March of 2015, and Yakuza Kiwami releasing in January of 2016. And due to just how accessible Kiwami is compared to the PS2 original, this is the version of Yakuza 1 that most newer fans to the series have played, which made me very curious about this game going into it. With most fans starting with 0 and then going into Kiwami afterwards, how does that experience compare to the one that I had starting with the original Yakuza 1 at the beginning of this series? Well, over the last week, I sunk a little over 30 hours into Kiwami during my first playthrough of it, and have realized that the answer to that question is actually pretty complicated. So, does Yakuza Kiwami manage to remake the game that started this whole series in a way that not only updates it for newer fans, but also retains the core of the experience? And more importantly, does it manage to stand on its own as a strong entry in the Yakuza series? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 12th in a series of videos where I'm playing every single game in the Yakuza series for the first time in release order and reviewing them as I go along. This video will primarily be focused on Kiwami itself and how it holds up as a remake of the original game, so I won't really be going over the original or my thoughts on that game too in depth here, as I've already made a dedicated video just for that. So if you're interested in watching that first, or just seeing the whole rest of the series in general, I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below. But with that out of the way, Yakuza Kiwami is a remake of the original Yakuza for PlayStation 2, developed by RGG Studios and published for consoles and PC in 2016. The game faithfully retells the story of the original while massively overhauling the gameplay and even recreating the majority of the original game's side content. So there's a lot to talk about here in regards to how Kiwami holds up compared to the original, but I think it's only natural to start with the main story. Back in the original release on the PlayStation 2, the main story was easily the highlight of the entire experience, and thankfully, that's still the case here in Kiwami. We still start things off with series protagonist Kazuma Kiryu being pretty much in his prime in the mid-90s, until his sworn brother Nishikiyama kills the patriarch of their Yakuza family, and Kiryu takes the blame for it to protect him. After spending 10 years in prison, Kiryu is released and finds himself in a world that, while vaguely familiar, is very different from the one he knew before. And in the middle of trying to come to terms with what those lost 10 years actually mean for him, he finds out about a war ensuing within the Tojo clan, and all sorts of chaos ensues. The entire main story has been recreated here in a very faithful manner, with most of the original voice actors returning to reprise their roles, the dialogue only being minorly changed in certain places to better fit the overall narrative of the franchise, and most of the cutscenes even being recreated shot for shot. Kiryu even feels distinctly more aggressive here than fans of the more recent entries will probably be used to, which is absolutely great because that's just how he was in the first couple PS2 entries, and I was honestly worried that they would ease up on that a bit to make him feel more consistent with the later games. But to my very pleasant surprise, he definitely still has that more rough edge that I tend to associate his Yakuza 1 and 2 appearances with. Now, that shot-for-shot recreation that I mentioned just a minute ago can feel a bit odd at times, as that distinctly PS2 style animation and scene pacing can feel a bit jarring in a game with otherwise more modern presentation. But it's awesome for fans of the original story like myself to be able to see it get such a big facelift here. Even more awesome though are all of the little additions that have been made in the hopes of further enriching the story of Yakuza 1. There are new scenes throughout the game that do a variety of little things for the story, but something that's consistent across almost every single one of them is that they further flesh out the history of and the relationships between Kiryu, Nishikiyama, and Yumi. Some of these go beyond simply adding new cutscenes too, with there being some parts of the main story that have been expanded from a gameplay standpoint, and some that are even just entirely new. Most of these are great from a story perspective, but I did feel like they were really inconsistent in terms of pacing. For example, that new part of Chapter 1 where we play through a flashback of Kiryu buying Yumi a ring for her birthday has us running around in circles throughout the city, going on this wild goose chase for upwards of 20 minutes trying to get this gift pulled together for her. So while I definitely appreciate getting to see the origin of this ring that goes on to be really important in Yakuza 1's story, I'm also not really sure if we needed to spend over 30 minutes of the game's opening chapter on it, as it just really slows down the pacing of the game's introduction. In terms of the cutscenes themselves though, these additions are really nice. Easily the standouts here though are all of the new scenes that show Nishikiyama slowly slipping and becoming more of a villain as his world quite literally crumbles around him after Kiryu goes to prison. These don't really give us any information that we didn't already know, but what's important is that they show us things that we had only ever heard about before, like how everyone around him compared him to Kiryu and made him feel inferior to him, or how all of the stress from everything happening to him during this time led to him just completely snapping after his sister's death. Being able to actually see these things happen on screen rather than just being told about them are exactly what this character needed to be more memorable, and absolutely make him a much more enjoyable antagonist overall. Speaking of Nishiki, it's worth noting here that Yakuza 1 never had any dynamic intros, but for Kiwami, they did go ahead and add one single dynamic intro exclusively for Nishikiyama's fight. And it is so good that I just have to nerd out about it at least a little bit here. They have Kiryu punching up at Nishiki with his wounded arm to symbolize not just how he's trying to rise above Nishiki in this moment, but also how it's just in his character to always push himself to rise above no matter how much it hurts him to do so. His posing in this shot is a near perfect reflection of not just the current fight, but also of his character as a whole. And the same goes for Nishiki here, who they've posed punching down at Kiryu to symbolize not just how Nishiki rose to the top by putting others down rather than by building himself up, but also how in this exact moment, he needs to put Kiryu down in order to stay on top. So again, it perfectly reflects the moment and the overall character of Nishikiyama, while also showcasing the opposite nature of these two former brothers at this exact point in the story. It's just really good shit, and probably my new favorite dynamic intro out of the entire franchise. Aside from that though, there are a bunch of smaller additions that while they don't have a massive impact on the story whether positively or negatively, they're definitely worth at least bringing up. Things like how pretty much every text box scene from the original is now fully voice acted, which always helps to make them more engaging. They've also added some new walk and talk segments like the ones that we saw in Yakuza 0, which adds some nice little optional opportunities to do things like showcase how Kiryu's relationship grows with certain characters, and especially with Haruka over the course of the game. And Yumi's face has actually been changed quite a bit to make her look very similar to Haruka's Yakuza 5 model, which, you know, just kind of makes sense. And last but not least, the PC port has the option for all in-game cutscenes to play back at 60 frames per second instead of 30, making this the first game in the series to do so, despite the fact that both Ishin and Yakuza 0 ran at 60 FPS on the newer gen consoles. And I know that that's a really small point to bring up, but I was genuinely just so happy when I saw it in the settings after first installing the game. So pretty much everything that I've talked about so far is exactly what I had been hoping to get more of from Yakuza 0. Just story content that further fleshes out and enriches that original story. That being said though, while almost everything about Kiwami story-wise is a positive for me, I do have one issue that I wanted to bring up. That being the localization. Now, I'm not sure if it's because of the quick development time, but the localization in this game can be really weirdly inconsistent in ways that don't ruin the story necessarily, but definitely take away from the source material in a lot of little ways. The thing that happens the most here is that the English subtitles will say something that's almost exactly what the character is saying, but one or two words will be off, leading to the line having a very different feel than it should. For example, near the end of the game when Yumi, Kiryu, and Haruka all hug after reuniting, the English subtitles translate Yumi's line to say "Welcome back, Kazuma." But what she's actually saying in Japanese here is "Welcome home, Kazuma." Just one word, one tiny little word being slightly different can have a massive impact on the emotional tone of these scenes. And this has always been an issue to varying degrees in the Yakuza series, but unfortunately, Kiwami has much more of a problem with this than games like Yakuza 5 or 0 did before it, so it just feels like a very noticeable step back in that regard. Overall though, Kiwami does a great job recreating the story of Yakuza 1, so much so that experiencing it again in this remake reminded me of the fact that Yakuza 1 still has one of my favorite stories in the series so far. There are definitely some little hiccups here with things like inconsistent localization or poor pacing in some of the added or extended gameplay segments, but aside from those, this is the Yakuza 1 story pretty much exactly as fans from the PS2 era will remember it, along with some additions that further expand on that story in a way that only ever adds to it rather than taking away from it. Now, if only they could have done that with the Yakuza 0 director's cut. Something else that's a bit iffy in Kiwami is the soundtrack. Now, calm down, I'm not saying that because I think the soundtrack is bad, because it's still really good. I just don't think it's as good as Yakuza 1's was. A lot of the iconic tracks from the first game just aren't even present here, and the ones that are have been totally remade from scratch to mixed results. There are some tracks here, like For Whose Sake, that I feel have been made better, or at least I just personally enjoy them more. But I would say that most of the tracks that have been remade, like Funk Goes On for example, just don't sound as good as the originals, and almost feel like they were remade just for the sake of being remade. I also don't really feel like most of the remade or new tracks here really capture the feel of the original Yakuza OST. Yakuza 1 had music that felt much grungier and dirtier than anything else in the series, with a mix of heavily distorted lyrical tracks and guitars that matched the game's general tone immaculately. But Kiwami has gone for a more electronic sound that's clearly trying to fit in better with the sound of Yakuza 0's OST, but it just doesn't really land when the whole rest of the game is still trying to stick to the general tone of Yakuza 1. And this can really change the tone of a lot of the game, but it's especially apparent in just how much it changes the feel of a lot of Yakuza 1's most iconic boss fights. Here, I'll play a handful of tracks from the original and then compare them to their Kiwami counterparts so you can get a feel for what I'm talking about. easiest way to describe Kiwami is that it's a remake of Yakuza 1 that's effectively built off of the skeleton of Yakuza 0. That's not to say that it plays exactly like Yakuza 0, because it absolutely does not, but you can feel that Yakuza 0 Foundation's presence pretty much the entire time that you play, and you can even just see it in a lot of ways when simply watching the game in motion. So let's start things out like I always do with the gameplay part of these videos, and talk about the combat first. The first thing to mention here is that the style system has been carried right over from Yakuza 0, with all 4 of Kiryu's styles from that game being present, and also being available to you right from the start. So instead of the Dragon of Dojima style, which was the secret style that aimed to recreate Kiryu's iconic combat style from the original game being a secret unlock here, hidden behind a massive grind of side content, it's now available for players to use right from the start. Which makes sense because, you know, this is Yakuza 1, so you naturally want players to use Kiryu's Yakuza 1 style. And while I appreciate having the variety provided by Kiryu's other Yakuza 0 styles, you'll probably notice pretty quickly from my footage here that I almost exclusively used the Dragon style for the duration of my playthrough. Because, again, this is a remake of Yakuza 1, so I wanted it to feel like I was playing Yakuza 1. I really don't feel like the other styles being present was all that necessary, but I'm not exactly going to complain about the options being there, because admittedly, whipping out the Rush style when I needed a more evasive approach, or the Beast style when there were a bunch of heavy objects around, was still a really good time. Each of Kiryu's Yakuza 0 styles have been nerfed a decent bit here though, making them feel noticeably weaker than they did in the prior game, while the Dragon style has actually been buffed quite a bit, making it much stronger than it was in Yakuza 0, which is a nice way of offering those options, but still subtly pushing players into leaving their comfort zones with the main 3 styles, and transitioning over to the one that Kiryu would go on to use for the rest of the mainline series. But if you do still really want to use one of those Yakuza 0 styles, at the very least, Kiwami has done away with the heat gear system and gone back to a more traditional heat system. So even though they've all been nerfed in their own very specific ways, they've also all been buffed a bit compared to 0, as you're not actively being punished for not maintaining heat. So you can now actually use all of the options that these styles present you with without being actively punished for it by being given a slower attack speed, which is a huge win. And something that I have to praise Kiwami for a lot is just how much it improved the experience of switching between these styles on the fly. In the first couple games that introduced the style switching system, you could change between styles at any time mid-fight, but doing so required you to just stand there doing nothing and play out an animation in order to switch over. But in Yakuza Kiwami, they've added a ton of different ways for you to change between these styles much more smoothly. Things like how if you press the button to change styles right as you land the last hit of a combo, you'll just change to the new style immediately with no animation needed. Or how you can do the exact same thing by taunting and then pressing the button to change styles during the taunt animation. There are a bunch of these different methods of switching between them that are unlocked slowly as you progress through the skill tree, and not only do these make the experience of switching styles smoother, but also much more engaging, as whenever I wanted to switch to a different style here, I had to actually think about how I was going to do so. It's an awesome evolution all around, and I really hope that they stick with this system in future entries, as it's just really good. And probably the most interesting part of the style system here is that they actually start the player with the majority of the late game upgrades right from the beginning, including a maxed out health bar and heat gauge. This seems really weird at first, but after Chapter 1 comes to a close and we have that 10-year time jump where Kiryu's in prison and not out on the streets fighting people, we start Chapter 2 with Kiryu being the weakest he's ever been in the entire franchise. His health bar and heat gauge are both tiny, and you'll notice when trying to use his dragon style that you don't even get access to half of the style's basic combo strings anymore. I mean seriously, the longest combo possible at this point is a simple 2 light attacks followed by a heavy attack. That's it. Beyond that, when using the dragon style at this point in the game, Kiryu isn't even capable of building up any heat or using heat actions whatsoever. So those short combos and simple grab attacks are literally all that he's capable of after his 10 years in prison. And I actually love this. I'm a huge fan of RPGs starting you with basically nothing and making you work to build yourself up to being incredibly powerful by the end. And beyond all that, it just makes sense story-wise too. Kiryu being considerably stronger at the start of Yakuza 1 than he was in 0 is reflected by the player starting with all those upgrades, but then the fact that he was stuck in a prison cell for 10 years, unable to keep his techniques sharp, is reflected by him getting out and being weaker than he's ever been before. And what's even better is that Kiryu's 3 main styles from Yakuza 0 are all actually pretty decent at this point, which also just makes a lot of sense, as these styles were much rougher and less refined in Yakuza 0 because Kiryu hadn't had the opportunity to train and refine his techniques properly yet. The dragon style is the only one that's hit as severely as it is, as that's the one that requires a lot of practice and knowledge to be able to be effective. So once again, this is just really good stuff, and helps enhance that original Yakuza 1 experience after us now having Yakuza 0 available. I'll come back to the combat styles a bit when we get to the open world and progression stuff though, so for now, let's talk about another new addition to the combat, the Essence of Kiwami. These are essentially just Kiwami's version of those unique boss fight heat actions, with each style in the game having its own Essence of Kiwami that you'll use exclusively during boss fights. At certain points during these fights, the boss will enter an exhausted state and start to glow a certain color while rapidly regenerating their health. When this happens, you'll need to enter the style that correlates to the color they're glowing and stand in front of them to get the prompt for this heat action. And this is an addition that I'm a bit more mixed on, as all of these new heat actions are absolutely awesome, but their implementation is just a little weird. This seems to exist primarily to give players a reason to try to build and maintain their heat during boss fights, rather than just immediately cashing it in on some big heat damage every time. And I think that that's an admirable goal, but I feel like letting the bosses just rapidly regenerate their health multiple times per fight wasn't exactly a great way to go about encouraging that. I also don't love that these require you to use a specific style at specific times, because while I get that the developers might have had certain styles in mind for each fight, if I'm crushing a boss with the dragon style, even though they were designed with the rush style in mind, just let me keep using the dragon style if it's working well for me. So overall, I think they have a fun idea here, but I just don't think it was implemented very well. The other complaint that I have with Kiwami's combat is that the asset reuse from Yakuza 0 is kind of insane in this game, and really starts to affect the combat as you play more and more of it. This generally wouldn't be something I would complain much about, as if you can make a game that feels genuinely fresh while using those old assets to get it done in a quicker and more efficient manner, I'm all for that. But I definitely start to have an issue with it when some of the most iconic boss fights from the original game are just reusing movesets from other characters in Yakuza 0 rather than having their own unique fighting styles recreated here. For example, take Shimano, one of the earliest bosses in the game, and easily one of the most memorable, as you'll actually fight him again later on in the story. Instead of recreating his original moveset, or just making one that's different but has a similar feel to it, they've instead just pulled over the Mr. Shakedown moveset from Yakuza 0 for him. This means that if you've played Yakuza 0 and have a solid amount of experience farming Mr. Shakedown for cash, this boss is going to be an absolute pushover for you, as you've already learned how to fight this guy perfectly before even starting the game. And keep in mind, this was the first really difficult boss of Yakuza 1, and the one that really shows you what the boss fights have in store for you as the game goes on. So they've effectively trivialized the first major skill check of the game for anyone who played the game that came out right before it. This isn't the only example of bosses in this game just pulling their movesets from Yakuza 0, but it's easily the one that bothered me the most because of the fact that they chose a moveset that Yakuza 0 players will have already mastered fighting against. Overall though, I did really enjoy Kiwami's combat, especially once I had reached the end of the game and gotten all of the upgrades for the dragon style. It has a decent amount of things that I don't like about it, even small things that I didn't really get too much into here, like the heat consumption being kind of ridiculous on some of the heat actions, but there was an undeniable fun factor to it, and I definitely enjoyed it more than I did Yakuza 0's. I still wouldn't say that I enjoyed it as much as something like Yakuza 5 or Ishin, but it was really fun to go back to Kiryu's classic fighting style from the PS2 games and experience the main character of the series in his prime again after all of the prequels, spin-offs, and just games where he had gotten older and rustier. In fact, the dragon style is so powerful here that once you have it upgraded, there's very little reason to even bother with the other styles, which I absolutely believe was an intentional choice to drive home Kiryu being in his prime due to the nerfs of the other three styles as well as the buffs to this specific style. It may not be the most well-designed or balanced combat from the series so far, but it's definitely some of the most fun that I've had with it out of any of the games, which is well worth giving the game a lot of credit for. But where these Yakuza discussions tend to get really interesting is when we start talking about the open world and the side content. Interestingly though, Yakuza Kiwami has significantly less to talk about in this regard, as it's a remake of Yakuza 1, so even with all of the additions that have been made here, we're still talking about one of the simplest open world experiences in the franchise. Despite that, we'll probably still be here for a little bit, as the things that are there to talk about are pretty interesting. And yes, we'll get to that. To start, we have to talk about Kamurocho itself and how it feels in this game, because as a big fan of Yakuza 1, and especially just the general vibe that game had, the Kamurocho of Yakuza Kiwami does not feel like the same one that we saw in Yakuza 1. Now, obviously, a lot of this comes down to the fact that they've largely just reused the Kamurocho map from Yakuza 0 and made some adjustments to it in an attempt to make it feel different, but it just feels way too similar to Yakuza 0's in my opinion. The Kamurocho of Yakuza 1 had a totally different feel with significantly less neon lights and much more dull colors throughout, leading to a Kamurocho that still felt like a bustling red light district, but one that felt distinctly cold and unwelcoming. Yakuza Kiwami's Kamurocho retains a lot of the lights and warmer colors from Yakuza 0 though, making it feel less like I was running around the world of Yakuza 1 and more like I was running around the world of Yakuza 0. This was amplified even more by the fact that, aside from the presence of the Millennium Tower, the street layout is the same as Yakuza 0's as well, despite the fact that parts of that layout were significantly different in the original back on PS2. This even extends to some of the businesses here, with some restaurants from Yakuza 1 just being replaced by their counterparts from Yakuza 0 instead of being recreated. For example, the gelato shop that would normally be present on this street corner in the original has just been replaced by the takoyaki shop from 0. All of this was pretty disappointing as someone who loves that original Kamurocho's feel, and in my opinion, actually takes away from the feeling of Kamurocho changing and evolving over time that the series had pretty much nailed up to this point, especially considering that most newer fans of the series view this remake as a total replacement for the original, so they've never really experienced the Yakuza 1 Kamurocho. That being said though, I did love the fact that the majority of the original game's sub-stories have been remade here. I actually 100%ed Yakuza 1 on stream over the course of a few months earlier this year, so seeing a ton of my favorite sub-stories from the original return here, and in a lot of cases even be improved with the more modern approach that RGG takes for sub-stories, was a real joy. All of the original's mini-games have been retained here as well, along with the addition of all sorts of new ones that were introduced to the series after Yakuza 1, like pool, bowling, karaoke, and even the Pocket Circuit minigame from Yakuza 0, complete with a new line of sub-stories that see Kiryu reconnecting with all the friends he made playing Pocket Circuit in the late 80s. And while it's not technically entirely new, they have repurposed the catfight minigame from Yakuza 0 into a new deck-building arcade game called Mesu King, And they've even added a whole line of sub-stories that pertain to this game as well. I definitely ended up enjoying Mesu King way more than the original catfights, so this was a great move in my opinion. So at the core of it, almost every bit of Yakuza 1's side content has been remade here, and there are a lot of great additions that feel totally natural as well. They've even brought over the completion point system from Ishin and Yakuza 0 here to encourage players to actually go out and engage with all this stuff as much as possible. So as far as side content goes, my opinion is actually really simple. I feel like Kiwami manages to faithfully recreate the side content of Yakuza 1 while also further enriching it with all those little additions and improvements, which is a huge win. The progression is where Kiwami gets really interesting though, as it's very different from not just Yakuza 1, but every other game in the series as well. A lot of the progression here still feels pretty simple, like how we've gone back to a basic XP system where you earn experience by defeating enemies or completing sub-stories, and then use that XP to unlock new skills. But the first major catch here is that that experience can only be used to unlock new skills for Kiryu's 3 main fighting styles from Yakuza 0, and if you want to progress the dragon style at all, you'll have to engage with an entirely new system. This system is probably the single most controversial thing about Yakuza Kiwami, so buckle up because we're going to be talking about this one for a bit. In Kiwami, the team really wanted to add a new form of progression, and figured that one of the best ways to do so would be by tying it into the fan-favorite character Goro Majima. Now, Majima was always in Yakuza 1, but he had a grand total of 3 appearances throughout the game, and one of those appearances was simply a short cutscene near the beginning. But here, Majima's dialogue during that cutscene at the start of the game has been changed significantly, and he promises Kiryu that he'll be watching him closely and finding reasons to fight him whenever he can. This leads to the Majima Everywhere system, where throughout the entire game, no matter what you're doing, Majima can spontaneously appear and pull you into a fight with him. He can be out patrolling the streets looking for you, hiding under an object and waiting to jump out at you. He can randomly join your random encounters, appear out of nowhere to challenge you to a minigame battle. Literally whatever you're doing, he can be there. And as much as I love Majima, I'm really mixed on this system. I think that Majima and Kiryu's relationship in the original Yakuza 1 was pretty much perfect for where they both were at that point in the story. They weren't necessarily enemies, but they definitely weren't friends either, and leaned a little more towards the enemy side of the scale. This was not only a really fun dynamic for them in Yakuza 1, but also set things up for them to start reluctantly working together in Yakuza 2, and eventually just become full-on allies in Yakuza 3. Here though, their entire relationship has been changed for the sake of this system's inclusion. Now at the start of the game, these two are just already friends, but that sort of friendship where Majima just loves to annoy Kiryu as much as possible, and Kiryu acts like he hates it, but you can tell that he's secretly having fun. This is already a really drastic shift, and one that I'm not necessarily a fan of. And it also leads to some major inconsistencies with Majima's existing scenes from Yakuza 1. As the cutscenes that precede both of his later boss fights haven't had their dialogue changed, so they don't reflect this new relationship, or the fact that Majima's been chasing Kiryu around town constantly. Majima even still says things like, "It's been a while, Kiryu," which in the original was meant to allude to the fact that Majima hadn't seen Kiryu since before he got sent off to prison 10 years prior. But now, it just feels incredibly out of place, as not only have I already seen him since getting out, but I've even fought him like 20 times that exact same day. Beyond even just that, Majima Everywhere doesn't only insert Majima encounters into the open world, it also places him into spots in the main story that he shouldn't be, like how you'll now fight him 2 chapters prior to this scene at the funeral. So even if you're avoiding him in the open world and not fighting him often, they've still put an encounter into the main story right after Kiryu gets out of prison, which somehow ensures that this inconsistency stays present even if you're purely blasting through the main story. I also just feel like locking progression for the dragon style behind this system was an incredibly odd choice. I mean, the experience system has been simplified again compared to the last couple games to make the progression more streamlined, but then they made it so that you can't unlock any upgrades for the Yakuza 1 style with the XP you're earning, in a remake of Yakuza 1. All of the Yakuza 0 stuff is super easy to unlock as you play, even if you don't go out of your way for it. But if you want the Yakuza 1 stuff, you're going to have to intentionally go out of your way to grind for it in order to unlock any of it. As critical as I am of this system though, it's damn fun. Having a wandering boss fight in the open world with massive rewards available for beating them worked wonderfully in Yakuza 0, and it still works just as well here. It's also really fun that Majima will use his styles from Yakuza 0 when fighting you here, and swap between them regularly, which is just really cool to see after playing as him for half of the prior game and understanding what each style is capable of. Not to mention how much fun it is to now be on the receiving end of those attacks instead of dishing them out yourself, which really just puts in perspective how powerful some of these techniques actually are. And as much as it changes his relationship with Kiryu in the context of Yakuza 1, it's hard not to smile at all of the fun and wacky interactions that these two have here, as this new relationship they've been given is just so well written, and the two of them bounce off of each other damn near perfectly. So while it's absolutely nothing like what was in the original game, it's just so well written that it's hard to actually stay mad at it for very long. You also get these super elaborate set pieces with Majima every time that you hit a new milestone in the Dragon Styles progression, and easily my favorite of the bunch is the one where he dresses himself and the rest of the Majima family up like zombies for a scene that just ends up being a giant Dead Souls reference. It even reuses some of the old zombie models from Dead Souls, and plays music from the game, which means that I now have an excuse to use Dead Souls music in this video, which is a huge win in my book. Something that's not much of a win though, is the random encounter rate in this game. Those of you who have been keeping up with the Yakuza videos know that this is an ongoing battle with me in these games, and yeah, Kiwamis are pretty rough. Random encounters are absolutely everywhere in this game, and honestly might be some of the most obnoxious from the series so far. To start, they are way too numerous, to the point where I would often run into 2 or sometimes even 3 random encounters that are only a couple dozen feet away from each other and would all activate at once. And that mechanic that Yakuza 0 added where you could just throw money on the ground to distract the enemies from even trying to fight you has been removed here. So on top of the super high number of encounters out there, players have also lost their ability to buy their way out of the fights that they don't want to take. Now add on to this that the amount of experience you stand to gain from these encounters just frankly isn't worth it in a game that features the Majima Everywhere system. See, Majima is considered a proper boss fight, so he's a bit harder to take on, but beating him a single time can earn the player about 60 bars of experience in the early game, and literal hundreds of bars of experience in the late game. Your average random encounter with Street Thugs, on the other hand, will only offer you about 1 bar of experience, or maybe 2 if you get pretty lucky. So the question is, why would I ever want to fight these average thugs if I could just put in a little more effort and get upwards of 50 times the reward for doing so? The random encounters in this game just feel like an absolute waste of time, and after only like an hour in the open world, I realized how pointless these fights were and actively avoided them for the entire rest of my playthrough. And this actually allowed me to get all upgrades in the game with only just a few hours of farming Majima everywhere, as simply fighting Majima earns you upgrades for the dragon style, and the copious amounts of experience gained from beating him allowed me to max out all 3 of the other skill trees well before I was even done with the dragon style. But this brings up another area where I feel Kiwami takes a step back from the original. That being that even once you've maxed out every upgrade in the game, you're still being constantly swarmed by random encounters and Majima fights. See, I mentioned earlier that I actually 100%ed Yakuza 1 earlier this year, and in the process of doing so, I actually learned about one of the most interesting systems that was present in the PS2 era of the franchise. This is the XP cap that was present in both Yakuza 1 and 2. In those games, the team at RGG didn't want players to get too overpowered too early into the game, so they made it so that every single chapter had an amount of XP set for the XP cap, and if you surpassed that set amount, the game would actually stop spawning random encounters until you progressed further into the main story. This is a system that can be a bit of a pain in the ass if you're trying to get 100% completion, as it prevents you from having an easy way to reduce your health so you can go eat at restaurants. But aside from that, I actually really liked it because it was just super nice to have random encounters stop spawning and be able to go around and do stuff uninterrupted for a while. It also ensures that the main story content will have at least some challenge to it throughout the entire game, and also forces players to pace out their grinding instead of doing it all at once, as even hitting the XP cap in the first place requires you to do a considerable amount of side content without touching the main story. This system was dropped with the series' transition to the PS3 though, and as far as I'm aware, hasn't returned since. But if there was ever a newer Yakuza game that could have used either that system or something similar, it would have been Kiwami, as the amount of fights thrown at you while you're running around the open world in this game is insane, and the fact that there's no system in place that reduces that encounter rate even just a little bit once you've maxed out all upgrades in the game is a bit ridiculous to me. A less frustrating change, but one that's still a bit weird to me, is that the training with Kiryu's original master Komaki has been made a bit more involved than in the original game. In Yakuza 1, once you had met Komaki during the main story, all you had to do to receive training from him was just hit a minimum level for the specific training that he had prepared for you, and then go speak to him to receive said training and learn a new technique. Here in Kiwami though, this level requirement has been dropped and replaced by requiring the player to go and grind out a bunch of fights in the underground fighting coliseum to earn points, and then exchange those points at the shop there for certain items that Komaki asks you to bring back to him. So instead of just being able to go around doing whatever side content you want and eventually being able to go back for training later, you now have to go and grind out one specific piece of side content in order to unlock more Komaki techniques, which, while not a huge deal, is just another slight downgrade in Kiwami's progression compared to the original. I'm sure that this one is a little bit subjective, but I also doubt that there are many players out there who would prefer to grind one specific activity rather than be rewarded for just going out and doing whatever piece of side content they want to. Overall though, I think it's really important to state here at the end that I really did enjoy my time with Yakuza Kiwami. It has plenty of things that I don't like about it, especially when it comes to the progression systems and the impact that these have on the overall pacing of the game, but I'd be lying if I said that I didn't have a great time with it. Now, that being said, as a huge fan of Yakuza 1, this didn't feel like I was playing Yakuza 1. It basically just felt like an entirely new Yakuza game built off the foundation of Yakuza 0 that happens to retell the main story of Yakuza 1. So while I really enjoy the game, I also really dislike the notion that this replaces the original. If you're looking for that more simple, humble beginning of the franchise with an atmosphere and general vibe that's unlike anything else in the series, Kiwami won't deliver that for you. And that's totally okay. I personally love remakes that offer a unique take on the original and something meaningfully different from it, and that's what Kiwami is. Fans like myself get something that feels vaguely similar to the Yakuza 1 that they loved, but that's also entirely fresh and just feels like a whole new game, and that's a good thing. It keeps that great story, but massively expands the side content and brings us a progression system that, while needlessly grindy and at times pretty annoying, also gives us some of the most fun character interactions in the series. But I 100% urge any of you out there who played this in place of the original to find a way to go back and experience it someday if you can, because I'm telling you, you will be shocked by just how unique Yakuza 1 still feels to the entire rest of the series, and how much fun it can be in spite of all its PS2 jank. So overall, I really do think it's a good remake, but just not one that replaces the original Yakuza 1 for me, and I'm sure that years from now, I'll end up replaying both of them for their own different reasons. But at the end of the day, I'm going to give Yakuza Kiwami an 8 out of 10. That's going to wrap up this video, but do be sure to check out my other Yakuza videos if you haven't seen them already, or if you're feeling a little extra spicy today, maybe check out a similar series that I did a while back on the Armored Core games. Thank you for watching, and as always, an extra special thank you to the channel members and patrons who generously contribute to the channel and help make series like this one possible. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like on it, as it really does help me out with the algorithm a lot, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more reviews like this one in the future. Thank you all again for watching, and I hope to see all of you right back here for the next Yakuza review.